presentation at Royal Roads, we always acknowledge the lands that we are on. So Royal Roads University is located on the traditional lands of the Cossepsum and the Lekwungen ancestors and families. And many of us are working from home still from many different locations right now. I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Cowichan peoples. So really grateful to be able to do the work that we do wherever we're joining from today. So we always like to just take a minute to acknowledge that. And without further ado, I will be passing off the torch today to Dr. Dale, who is the Director of the School of Environment and Sustainability and the Program Head for our Masters of Arts and Masters of Science in Environment and Management programs, amongst many, many other accolades and titles that she now holds. So I am thrilled that she's going to be taking us through this conversation today. This is the second episode in our Building Back Better webinar series. And today is all about the biodiversity, climate change, and human health nexus. So Anne, I will hand it over to you to introduce yourself some more and Rob as well.
Thanks very much, Christy. So I have been at Royal Roads since the year 2000. I held Royal Roads' first Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Community Development and still continue to actively research in that area. And I've had a number of research grants, published a whole bunch of stuff, and that's enough about me, because I'm absolutely delighted to be here talking to one of my most favorite former students from Royal Roads University, Dr. Rob Newell. Do you want to explain a bit about yourself, Rob?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. So I'm Rob Newell. I'm adjunct professor at Royal Roads, and as Anne indicated, I've worked with Anne with her research chair program previously to where I am right now, but for many years. Currently, I'm in Abbotsford, so I'm in the territory of the Stalo Nation. I'm the associate director at the Food and Agriculture Institute. What a lot of my work does, and the stuff that we'll talk about today, is looks at integrated planning. So ways in terms of ways of doing different strategies, implementing different policies in a manner that you understand the connections between, for instance, climate action and a whole variety of social, economic, and environmental factors. So I'll leave it there at that because we'll get into the details of what that means in a moment here. But yeah, happy to be here today. So, and back over to you.
Thanks, Rob. So we're talking today about the intersectionality between climate change, human health, and biodiversity. And I would argue, although I've led several teams in climate change adaptation and mitigation, I would now argue that biodiversity conservation is the human imperative for this century. The biodiversity loss is just primordial. In fact, a recent scientific report said that we may be entering a sixth mass extinction. And the biggest difference between climate change, adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity is there's no second chance with biodiversity. When a species becomes extinct, that's it. So we still have a bit of time now to address climate change. And I think we're hitting critical tipping points. Business leaders are coming forward. But I think what's really going to move us is Greta Thunberg and her younger, tremendous social movement of younger people. Politicians are very aware that many of these young people are 16 and in 2 years are going to be voting. And nothing matters to change the political agenda more than knowing that it's going to be a vote. So to me, when you aim for biodiversity, climate change is what we call a co-benefit. It follows because all of the things that you do for biodiversity are also going to help climate change. And then, of course, the connection with human health. Apparently, Robin, you're better at statistics than I am. More people die from air pollution a year than have died from COVID-19. And we keep forgetting that fact. So there's the connection to human health as well. I don't know what you think, Rob.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to jump on that point around biodiversity as being a stronger imperative. And Actually, I have three strong arguments as to why this would be the case. First, I mean, I think it'd be worthwhile to draw attention to that cartoon that was shared around for quite some time. It was that I think a lot of people might have seen this, where you have this community on the beach and then this COVID tidal wave coming in, and then the tidal wave behind it was the economic recession tidal wave. But then what happened with this cartoon was that it got shared around, and in the social media sphere, people started photoshopping and adding other waves to it. First, climate change came on there, but this was the interesting part. Biodiversity was the larger wave that came behind climate change. So that speaks to your point, Anne. And there's actually multiple reasons as to why biodiversity is a critical imperative. First one, and it's kind of probably maybe the most straightforward one, that biodiversity is associated with the ecosystem services that keep us rolling. You know, those provisioning ones provide us the food, regulating our climate and our micro temperatures. The cultural services that kind of give us a sense of like wondering why we like things that we like in life, right? The connection to the world, and also those supporting services. So that's kind of the more straightforward answer there. But there's that other point, Anne, that you do make that's really quite interesting, because you can do climate change without necessarily recognizing the biodiversity imperative. I mean, you can make the broader argument that anything you do towards climate change ultimately can help biodiversity because of the relationship. But if you think of it, when you start focusing on things like energy innovations and reductions in emissions, it's not necessarily as direct of a benefit towards biodiversity. And in some cases, there can be conflicts. An interesting one around landscape connectivity, when you think about energy innovations around distributed energy and putting up wind turbines, what you're actually doing is you're creating more need for service tracks to service and build those turbines. So you're actually basically fragmenting the landscape. So that could actually be kind of counteractive to biodiversity. But then go the other way around, right? All those sort of things, those innovations that you do to help biodiversity and you know, protect habitat, you're creating a lot of carbon sequestration potential. You're creating green infrastructure for adaptation purposes. So really approaching climate action from that biodiversity lens really becomes quite useful, where it's not necessarily the other way around. And then the final point, I think, is really, this is kind of a strong one, is like really the profile of the issue is a big concern. You know, the IPCC has been around for a while. Climate change has really gotten into the public conversation. Biodiversity is one of those things that people have chatted about for you know, quite some time, but quite often it's been associated with sort of these single species efforts, right? You know, protecting panda rather than necessarily thinking about the full ecosystem. So you think about the group, the more recently formed IPBES, that tried to do for biodiversity what IPCC did for climate change. Yet they're finding these challenges because it hasn't really permeated into that public consciousness, which in its own right kind of makes it a more pressing imperative and issue, I think. So yeah, those would be my thoughts around that. I don't know if around that last piece, I know, Anne, you've done a lot of work around communications, particularly with your campaign. So I don't know if you wanted to kind of speak to that, refute that last point, but I think you probably have some interesting insights there.
Oh, what a nice lead in, dear colleague. I appreciate it. So I lead with a group of young people, a biodiversity action campaign that's national. And it's around biodiversity conservation, but as well, the need to protect spaces and areas in Canada, and that we need to increase our protected spaces from, I think we're sitting at about 16% to 30%, and I would argue to 50%. So you can see how protecting, having protected areas, parks, and so forth also helps climate change adaptation and mitigation, because they'll act as carbon sinks, but they also serve as a biodiversity library of many of the species that we're losing before we even have classified them. And I want to talk about, and then as part of this campaign, we have a series of podcasts, and they're all on biodiversity, and I encourage you to go to that. And I know Christy will put the website in. There's one done by a dear colleague of mine, Valerie B. and Pelche, one of the North America's foremost soil mite experts, on the importance of soil mites and the poor old worms. You know, we don't think about how very, very important worms are, not just for our own personal gardens, but for agriculture and for our food sources. And so I think it's really important that we understand that I use the axiom on my own property here by the lake, do no harm. So if I can, I avoid stepping on a worm. Why kill something when you don't have to kill it? But to show the importance of knowing and mapping and classifying our biodiversity, there's the aspect to human health. So there's a plant called the Chilean soapbox tree. And it is a treatment that boosts the body's immune reaction to vaccines called a vaccine adjuvant. I'll put it in the chat box. But recently, that adjuvant has now been integrated into the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine. That's how critical some of these plants are, and fungi even that we've got that are so important, and it just emphasizes the interconnectedness. I don't want to scare you, and I'll turn it over to Rob because he'll be more positive probably. The 2020 State of the World's Plant and Fungi estimates that 723 plant species that are used medicinally are threatened with extinction, with around 4,000 species of plants and fungi being scientifically described for the first time every year. The world's wild ecosystems represent a medicine cabinet of many as yet unknown therapeutics.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the maybe shift things as more positively as, as you promised that I would, thinking that then I guess the question is then how do we approach this, right? And this is sort of where we're getting to the heart of what we're talking about today in integrated planning. There's a lot of discussion around nature-based solutions, right? And nature-based solutions,
Right.
nature climate solutions being kind of a variant on that, they inherently have co-benefits. So let's just maybe stop here and just kind of talk a little bit about this terminology. Term co-benefits is a research that and you and I have spent a good amount of time on, particularly in the climate action realm. And it's also research that I've personally found in my life, stuff that attracts like practitioners to my research and gets them to reach out to me, because it inherently is quite an attractive thing. It's basically this idea of if you're to do climate action, what are those benefits that aren't directly related to mitigation and adaptation? Good example, you create a good trail system that's part of an integrated larger park system. You do have good green space for things that might be good for adaptation, good microclimates. You've got good walkability, gets cars off the road, so reduces emissions, but also does wonderful things for community health, livability, mobility, that sort of thing. It also serves as a way of stormwater management, so you can protect riparian zones and freshwater systems. So those would be the co-benefits. Now with nature-based solutions, and this is where people get really excited about this sort of thing, is that they inherently have co-benefits, right? If the benefit that you're trying to target is the supporting ecosystem services and supporting ecosystems, enhancing ecosystems and biodiversity, if you're choosing a route to target another solution or problem through that route, then yeah, you'll get that biodiversity benefit, but then you'll also solve the issue that you're trying to solve. So to clarify, ways of protecting property fronts, right? A nature-based solution would be to protect the intertidal zones, right? A lot of places protecting mangroves, great habitats for that. They do wonderful things in terms of protecting property from storm surges, flooding, and so forth. So taking that approach rather than putting hard barriers and hard structures, that would be considered a nature-based solution. You got the benefit of protecting the property and land, but also you have the benefits, all the benefits that come out of from the enriching the habitat and the biodiversity that is there. I mean, a recent study earlier this year just kind of showed this is stuff that seems fairly intuitive, but it's always good to have confirmed by research. Just shows the amount of productivity that can happen with protected mangroves, and like the biodiversity that can come out of that. And when you think about the productivity, you're not just looking at things like it's great to have a whole variety of different species in there, but you're also looking at very, very useful and efficient nutrient cycling. You're also looking at ways of being able to filter and manage pollutants and things that can come through that way too. So yeah, multiple benefits there, but I think that would be the optimistic lens on it, saying that this is an issue, but it also provides a very, very plausible and viable route for solutions for a whole variety of our challenges.
Yeah, this whole area of nature-based solutions I find really, really exciting. Did I cut you off, Rob?
No, sorry. I was just I was wondering if you wanted me to ask a follow-up question on that, but anyway, go ahead. Yeah, please.
No, nature-based solutions, and at the same time, there's a lot of things that can be said for the aesthetics and the beauty that they'll bring into our lives. For example, one of the things that we could do is, and it's a local solution. So we need action at local, regionally, provincially, nationally, and of course, internationally. But we should be growing native plants, wildflowers, trees, or shrubs on road verges instead of the stuff that's growing now or grass. These are things that give back to the environment. Something we are working on here at Royal Roads called regenerative sustainability. It's not about sustaining, but it's actually creating and designing systems that will give back to the environment. Instead of a carbon neutral building, you have a carbon restorative building, and there's one at UBC that my colleague John Robinson led that actually gives energy back to the grid. So it's a totally new way of thinking about how we design and work with our environment. The other thing, Rob, that I think is really important, we all think we're going to have biodiversity in our lives. We can keep on developing, or I'd say growing is the better word than developing, more and more condos, more and more houses, and not leaving enough space for the critters. So there's another local solution that is really important, and it gets to the importance of integrated planning, is establishing natural and semi-natural wildlife corridors and linkages.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the landscape connectivity piece is key, and it's one of those things that I think it's overlooked, particularly in the city planning. So, and referring to the paper, that perspective piece that you and I wrote last year, for the audience, Anne and I wrote this short paper just on reflections on COVID-19, right? And just this idea of what has COVID-19 taught us in terms of vulnerabilities and our needs and approaches in terms of creating or enhancing community resilience and sustainability. So the paper really basically just argues this idea of that COVID-19 just highlighted vulnerabilities. It didn't create them. It just highlighted and showed where these issues are. So moving forward, we need to kind of think about where are our communities vulnerable, just in a broader sense, and how can we increase resilience to a whole variety of exogenous outside shocks and socioeconomic disturbances. One of the big pieces that came in there was this idea of connectivity, and it was sort of sparked by this thought that one of the things that was safe to do even in the early stages of the pandemic was to be able to walk in parks, right, and be out there in the world, right? Now there's kind of a psychologial argument that you can make to this idea of still feeling that you're not fully isolated in the community and being able to walk in there, but there's also the physical health element, right? Just being able to be out and wander around, and which is also good for the mental health. So how does it actually inform planning? Well, really, in order to be able to do this in a way that actually benefits the entire community, you got to think about how can you equitably distribute green space. And that is a connectivity issue. That is a connectivity problem. That's the idea of creating green corridors, park systems that allow people to basically walk from point A to point B to point C. Now, while you're doing that, and while you're doing this in a clever way, you're also, what you're doing is increasing ecological connectivity. And I have collaborated with colleague Nina Marie Lister out in Ryerson, who thinks about these questions a lot around landscape connectivity and integrated approaches to that. So this idea of thinking like, how can municipalities do this? You can create a beautiful park trail system, great for the mobility, but you're also doing good things in terms of ecological connectivity, rather than just doing these fragmented pockets of green space. You know, some of the conversations we had in the project we worked with, the Nina Marie Lister, was, you know, it talked about how that was the original approach. The old approach was, you know, green infrastructure and parks was just about putting green stuff in. But now I think there's more of an understanding about making things connected for both people and wildlife. You know, if a really good trail system that's also very cognizant of the fresh waterways that are around there can create a good trail buffer and green systems to protect those waterways, like I was talking about before. So you have protection in terms of stormwater runoff. Now you're also enhancing connectivity for the freshwater ecosystems. So those are the things. Now, it's weird because this sort of conversation idea kind of stimulated from this idea of being locked indoors, and the one thing that we can do is go out and wander about. But when you start looking at the linkages between the benefits and co-benefits, you can start taking a systems approach and doing integrated planning for better, more livable cities. At least, yeah, that's certainly what we argued then, and I can imagine you probably still argue that's the case.
Well, there's another aspect to connectivity by people getting and meeting and greeting one another, neighbors in a green space, or even just, you know, a bench, more benches along sidewalks where people can meet and greet. And that's an increase in social capital. And you want your neighborhoods and your communities to have high social capital, because as Putnam says, do you want more people knowing one another, or do you want more policemen on the street? So you want more eyes on the street and people looking after one another than necessarily more policemen. Rob, there's an interesting question in the chat here, and I don't know the answer. I don't know if you know the answer, but you're the geographer in the team. How important a role do space-based technologies play in improving the environment? Or is space usually an afterthought? We've had lots of discussions about place and space in the team.
Yeah. I'm going to briefly collect my thoughts, because I feel like I could go on for about an hour on this one. I mean, you're right. The geography element in history really does make me lean towards, yes, space does play a strong role, and I can maybe even speak from my own experience and research. That you know, spatial approaches, when some of the modeling and integrated planning that I've done before, there are certain things that are inherently spatial, right? And maybe I'll speak on this a bit, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to you to perhaps speak a little bit about spatial justice, right? But thinking in terms of some of the things we've talked about around sustainable community development, in some of the research that I've done with communities, there are certain things that people want to look for, certain things they want to enhance in their communities, objectives they want to achieve, that requires thinking about how communities, the patterns of development and how they develop spatially. So to give an example, working with the community of Squamish on an integrated model, and it was an integrated model that was based off their local concerns, needs, and values. One of the big things that they really wanted to explore was having local employment, right? As the community developed, they just didn't want it to necessarily go this trajectory of becoming a bedroom community for Vancouver. So that local employment question also led into a bit of a livability question, in the way that we're developing a lot of space for commercial, but are these spaces that are just kind of all in one space, or can people actually walk to their local employment, areas of employment? Are these like commercial areas that are distributed well? Then you get into the other question of it. are these also places that provide amenities that make the city a little bit more livable. So you're actually getting a kind of a distributed approach to developing these commercial pockets rather than just saying, okay, we need more commercial space altogether. Now, looking from an integrated planning perspective, Squamish also had goals around climate action and reducing emissions. So that is also a highly spatial question in this particular realm, because the idea of having like these local employment, can people walk to it so they don't necessarily have to drive and have the emissions out there? So there is a huge spatial element. However, and this is a big however, space and place are extremely different, right? I mean, they are very different elements. You know, space would be those sort of physical geometric aspects of it, if you will, whereas place is could be more the subjective geography, how we react to it. And they're both very important elements. Reason why I bring this up is because a lot of the modeling they did was in the GIS realm, and it was very useful for figuring out how to plan the community in a way that is not just you know, developing assets, developing things in local employment, developing parks, but in doing it in a way that's equitable and increases the quality of life for everyone. Now, the place element is then comes on the way that these things develop and how these things look locally, right? I mean, does that affect, or does it enhance, or does it interfere with people's sense of place, meaning the beliefs, values, the emotions that they associate with a place itself? So we had that spatial component of the modeling. And then from that spatial component, we made tools for engagement, one of them being interactive visualizations. Looking at some of the scenarios that we had, we look at sort of like, well, what if we created these nice little dense neighborhood nodes, these pockets, in which you have like a mixed use commercial living spaces, and we could look at medium and high density. That looked great in terms of the spatial modeling. But then when you went into the place-based aspect and some people started walking around and seeing what it looked like in these interactive first-person visualizations, what you're actually seeing is there's disruptions to the view shed with these really high density ones, disruptions to people's sense of place, the reasons why they moved to Squamish in the first place. Stuff like that can create opposition towards the local government, which is not a trivial thing. Also, we were talking about this before, Anne mentioned the beauty of biodiversity, and also I talked about the ecosystem services in terms of cultural ecosystem services. Essentially, if you're disconnecting people from those view sheds of, like, you know, the natural environment, you actually are kind of blocking them from those cultural ecosystem services. And depending where these things are placed, you might be doing it inequitably too, right? So that's where the kind of element of both space and place come in. I did mention too, this idea, it's important to think of both of them in terms of spatial justice, which I know is a topic that, and you've been thinking about a fair bit. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything about that, the idea of spatial justice and kind of the importance of that to layer on to this question around space.
Yeah, I would actually. Spatial justice is a building upon social justice where you also take into account space and place. So for example, I've been privileged to do some of my early research in the downtown east side. I don't know how many of you have ever visited the downtown east side, but it is, you know, a very, very sad place with high levels of addiction and mental illness, and they've been pushed more and more together as a result of the gentrification on the fringes. But as my close colleague Ken Loitier there, the founder of United We Can, a street charity, says, it's like there's this solid door between the rest of Vancouver and the downtown east trees. There's no green. And if you'll notice that, so this is the concept of spatial justice, where in poorer neighborhoods, you don't have the same access to the same amenities, you don't have the same kinds of beauty and aesthetics that exist in other neighborhoods. And it's very important. That's changed a bit now in the downtown east side, because you have something called soul foods, S-O-L-E. So they're doing some urban agriculture and growing their own foods, which is lovely. But you have to wonder then, why is there this tremendous disparity between one neighborhood and not another? And then it gets really more interesting. There was a journal article that it was a research project, and it showed that people got greater happiness from having 10 more trees planted on their street than a $10,000 salary increase, which I find phenomenal. And yet we take all of the biodiversity around us for granted and assume we are going to have it forever. So I think we're now at a stage in our population, how much space we take on the planet, that we have to deliberately plan to conserve and protect biodiversity in all its facets. And there's larger diversity issues as well, such as the loss of languages that is happening, you know, and especially the loss of indigenous languages. And this brings we worked on I'm laughing, Rob, I'm thinking of the community vitality project that we worked on. And so we developed vitality indicators for community. And what I'm laughing about is we asked the team to do pictures of spaces and places. And one of our colleagues, I think, was quite depressed, right? And what did he do? He did dead animals on the highway, and I think he even did cemeteries. Now, one could argue that cemeteries are actually green spaces. However, that's another whole debate. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, cemeteries, this is also becomes a planning challenge and objective, because cemeteries can definitely be green spaces for sure. Just thinking from my own experience, I'm very close to something called the Discovery Trail, and it routes right through the cemetery there, and part of it becomes part of a larger park network. So that on itself just becomes a way of being able to cleverly plan, and this kind of speaks to the things that we're talking about in terms of connectivity. And then, yeah, speak to the study about the trees and the mental health and the happiness. I mean, there have been a number of studies too that just talk about, or at least I know one that I often think about in terms of people's proximity and what this has done for mental health, which perhaps really speaks to this, the original title of this webinar itself, the Climate, Biodiversity, and Health Nexus. And I don't know if you mind if I shift gears and just start talking about Nexus approaches. Does that sound like a good time to do it? Let's do it. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, yeah, because this is an upcoming project that Ann and I will be working on. This idea of looking at climate, biodiversity, and health as a framework for addressing different planning challenges and applying it to different community systems. Now, I think I hope that Ann and I have made a case as to why climate and biodiversity are critical components to include into this framework. But I think it's also important to recognize too that this project itself is building off previous Nexus work. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to, in some ways, correct, or not necessarily correct, or build and maybe improve on some of the challenges that you had in the past. I think maybe a lot of people in this audience perhaps maybe recognize the water, energy, and food nexus. And if not, then let's just kind of break it down a little bit. Water, energy, food nexus was a proposed approach to urban planning, a proposed framing that the World Economic Forum made popularized about 10 years ago or so. And the idea of this is to be able to plan in a way that understands the intersection between water, energy, and food imperatives, right? So this idea of as we develop a city, how do we understand how to keep it energy efficient, make sure that we have access to clean, healthy water and abundant water too, as well as have local food production, or at least at the very least have a very strong, robust supply chain for food that goes in there. And they intersect with one another, right? So thinking about community strategies that might enhance or encourage things around indoor agriculture, right? So what if you have start indoor growing districts and you start developing brownfield areas with a bunch of indoor vertical growing systems, then you got local food production. Perhaps you are reducing water consumption because there are lower water needs. Energy, that's a big question mark, and that's part of what the Nexus does. Does this actually help energy consumption, or does it increase it, depending on the systems that we've implemented it there? but hopefully that just kind of gives an idea of what that Nexus approach is. Now, some of the issues, and this is where we're going into the title of this webinar today, is that people have looked at this and found it perhaps a little vague in terms of trying to operationalize it, right? So the idea is understanding that water, food, and energy are important things, but really, what is the goal there? I mean, it can be a little bit vague and fuzzy for what is your food objective, what is your energy objective, what is your water objective. With the CBH Nexus, it's trying to be a little bit more strategic, right? And then as Anne and I have been chatting, climate change and biodiversity have been recognized as critical imperatives for the sustainability of the world. Yeah, Johan Rockström and his colleagues put out this planetary boundaries framework that very clearly identified these as two of the 9 planetary boundaries that are important for us to keep within the safe operating zone. And also, these are 2 of the 9 that we've actually transgressed. So there's just so much literature and research saying that most of the things that we need to do, if not all the things that we need to do, need to be cognizant of those 2 elements. So then there's this one rogue one that we've only sort of been talking about. Why health? Well, similar to the water, energy, food nexus, there's actually been a fair bit of complaint about how, or critique, I should say, about how these things don't necessarily incorporate human needs, right? The social needs, the human elements of stuff. They're really much more around kind of like physical outcomes, those sort of things like metrics that really just have the amount of water, energy, and food, but without really that human element, right? So some people have done some research of trying to figure out where livelihoods actually fit within the water, energy, food nexus. In our case, what we're trying to do is bring in that health element to capture a lot of factors around social sustainability. So this is both mental health and physical health. So you can actually start seeing the usefulness of bringing this in, because really what it does is when you bring in that health element, what it does is it highlights the alignments and tensions of different strategies. So just thinking about in terms of agricultural development and food systems development, there are definitely studies and research, and people can speak anecdotally too about situations where there has been competition between ecosystems, perhaps forest cover ecosystems, and agricultural development, right? So you can kind of see a tension there, but the agricultural development on itself is actually quite important for people's livelihoods, right? And when people lose livelihoods, it can be challenging for mental health in communities and regions, right? So the important thing about bringing that health is that it really shines a light on those conflicts. I talked about co-benefits before. Co-benefits are great. They seem like great win-win situations, but that's not the reality of the world. Often you get co-benefits and trade-offs, win-win and losses. And so that last component, that third component of the Nexus, really allows us to explore those alignments and tensions in the human realm. Now, I know that someone on this webinar would be able to very eloquently argue that social sustainability is the least understood and of the 3 sustainability pillars, economic, environmental, and social. And so that's part of the reason why we're bringing that human component to look at that. But Anne, you've done a lot more work on that, so maybe I'll pass it over to you, and perhaps you can talk a little bit more about the challenges of trying to figure out the alignments and tensions around that social element of sustainability.
Well, it is the least understood because it involves knowing ourselves, and it also evokes the values that we have. So here's a simple value question. Is it important to manage ecosystems, or is it more important to manage human impacts on the ecosystem? So you can see in that question where we center ourselves as a species. And it's the rules, changing the rules of the game and the zoning bylaws and everything that has to be done. Somebody asked about, getting rid of weeds. Well, what we call a weed, what defines a weed versus a flower? And in many cases, these weeds have beneficial components. I'm going to switch to a more micro level here, which is something that I learned through having the privilege of leading the podcast. So, I mean, I'm an avid gardener, and I've been taking leaves off my gardens for, oh, geez, 30 years. I don't want to really say how long it's been. I might age myself too much, but for a very, very long time, because I like my garden to be pristine. Well, when I did the podcast with the bee expert, I learned that there are introduced bees and then there are native bees, and it's the native bees that we really want to conserve. Native bees overwinter in the leaf mulch on your gardens, and it's critical for them, and they do not leave that mulch until it's very, very warm. So then I decided, okay, I'm going to have a little social experiment, meaning me looking at my habits, my beliefs, my values around my garden. And I thought, I'm not going to take any leaves off the garden this year. I'm going to leave them on, because as they break down, they're a perfect mulch. And where does this image of a perfect garden come from? And you know what? You don't have to take your leaves off the garden. And my environmental organization was one of the first environmental groups this year to convince people to leave leaf mulch on their gardens for the sake of the bees and other critters that overwinter in that. So the social imperative is the more difficult one, because it means looking at ourselves. And I find it interesting. Many of you probably in the chat room don't recall the limits to growth debate that caused such a vicious debate about, that there being limits to the growth of the human population, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there are important social questions we have to ask ourselves, and where we center ourselves in nature. So in a recent podcast I led on beauty, can beauty save biodiversity? One of the statements that came up was, our most important relative right now is nature. But we really have to look, and are we capable of it? Now I'm going to turn Pollyannish, Rob, if you don't mind. We have enough science, we have enough knowledge, we have enough ability to design regenerative systems. We now need political will, and we need to change the rules of the game and what we define as a weed. Just as a sidebar, our dear colleague at Ryerson, Professor Nina Marie Lister, has taken on City Hall, because she lives in a very wealthy area of Toronto, and she has eliminated her grass and produced a native garden, and all of her neighbors have complained. So she's now suing the city to change their rules and regulations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting point. And actually, I'm glad that you brought up this the micro perspective too, because what it also highlights is when you bring in social sustainability and the human element, it makes a lot of these systems models that much more complex, right? Because you can't actually just put with a broad brush stroke what people value in terms of their the aesthetics and their environments, right? And to give an example, there was a study that was done in around visualizations. It was sort of a visual perception of environments in Japan, where they showed different images of both forests and agricultural space. One of the images around the agricultural space, they're showing things that were more conventional, that looked like a kind of larger monocultural type agricultural setups, and then things that are a bit more contemporary, that might have a more of a permacultural feel, like some people might actually perceive it as messy, right? And then the same thing with the forest, one that had like a kind of a clean understory, and then one that was a bit more overgrown. Now, the interesting thing is that I found that when they showed images to people of like, what do they prefer? Which ones are they attracted to? There was a huge generational divide, and also a huge working divide too, and or occupational divide. Younger students seem to kind of prefer the ones that were a little bit more wild, so to speak, right? So we're looking at the contemporary permaculture style of agriculture, and then the wilder forest, and then the older generations were looking at the things that were much easier to manage, right? And things that seemed that had a much easier time in terms of the economics of it, in terms of being able to use it and manage it as a resource base, right? So that's kind of part of the challenge of bringing in that human element. And when you're engaging people in these sort of integrated planning sessions, you can define different sustainability objectives. And one of them could be aesthetics, but I mean, what does that actually mean as an outcome, right? So now I don't really necessarily, oh, sorry, go ahead, Anne. Yeah.
No, yeah, great point. Thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, so I don't necessarily often like to leave on kind of like a note where, okay, this is a challenge without necessarily approach for addressing it, right? So I think this is often where some of the things that have come in around the work that I've done with the visualization stuff, and you've been involved in this visualization work too. This idea of creating some of these tools that the stuff that we worked with in the research are interactive visualizations, allow you to walk through it from a first-person perspective. Now, weirdly enough, because they're so visually interesting and interactive, one of the big questions I've often had to address around it is like, okay, I know it looks cool, but is it useful, right? But throughout the different research projects, what I've actually sort of found out was that it actually can help with these really difficult, fuzzy, almost intangible type outcomes and values where people can react to it from a more visceral level, something that allows them to see different scenarios, different ways of managing areas, and say that respond to it positively or negatively from like kind of a place that might not be fully even clear for them, but to basically react based on their sense of place, right? So the reason why I bring this up is because, like, sure, it is a big challenge trying to find things like what is a good aesthetic, what is the value of aesthetic for communities, but there are tools to do this. Now, visualizations are not a substitute for other tools. They do not do things that things like maps do and like quantitative models do. They're actually a complementary tool, and that's been more and more clear as pursued more of this research in the realm. So one of the big things and big challenges we're looking at right now is tool integration. How do you create a one-stop shop that allows people to engage with potential futures, potential plans, management scenarios, all in the same platform? And you know, I'm actually kind of heartened by the open source movement. It has provided a lot of tools that academics, NGOs could just get at their fingertips without too much of a cost and price point. So yeah, on that note, I don't know if Annie had kind of anything else to add around maybe the engagement, participatory elements of things, perhaps even around governance and interactive governance approaches. I know that I've worked much more in the tool realm, but I know that you definitely worked much more in the governance realm for these types of solutions and strategies.
Yeah, but there's an interesting question to the heart of some of my work, which is, can we talk about the dialogues? So I think the reason why we stay mired in the pipeline, no pipeline, in the old debates that divide us, is the lack of space and place to have critical conversations about key public policy issues. So what I've tried to do is to create a virtual place, I guess, or is it a space? That's the argument that we always go back and forth on, to bring together researchers with civil society leaders, with decision makers, policy makers, to talk about some of these critical issues. And I've learned so much that is harder to apply to my own life when I have a conflict with my neighbor over them shooting firecrackers across the lake. The queen of dialogue is hesitant to go over and talk to them about it, but that's what it takes. We don't have a consensus in this country on the ways forward. And if we can't see our way, which leads to the importance of Rob's visualization tools, to what the possible new scenarios are, we will stay mired in that old either or that just paralyzes from acting. And I think we've got to start asking the hard questions. It's enough to change the language, and language is critically important. and how we frame the issues, whether you frame it as a co-benefit or you frame it as a loss to society, is very, very important in getting people to act and getting them to act collectively. And sometimes I think it's the loss of the collective in North America at the expense of the individual that has caused an awful lot of our problems. Whereas France, one of my favorite countries, has both, has a very strong emphasis on the individual, but still has a very strong collective identity and a collective voice. So I just think it's really important, and to have those, and people say, well, what's the point of conversation? The point of conversation is taking the different perspectives, because no one sector, no one level of government, no one discipline can identify all of the solutions that we need to go forward. And I'm going to close with the words of one of my heroes, if you don't mind, Rob, before you, and that's from Greta Thunberg. And you know how you get hope? You get hope by acting. And it doesn't matter. I hope I've given you the message, and Rob has as well, that every action counts and every action makes a difference. So people say to me, why do you talk about moving the worm, Ann? Why is that so important to you? Because, you know, when you've got your head in the clouds with research all the time and you're being heavily criticized for what you think can do, moving that worm makes it real and empowers me to keep on going with the cloud stuff.
Yeah, great, thank you. And as a great little segue to a point that I really like to make before the end of this this session here, because I mean, I say this all the time, but I feel like it's really, really important to stress this. I know that I've talked about my research being in the integrated planning realm, but haven't fully explicitly said here that you can't really do integrated planning without participatory processes and good engagement, right? And there are a couple reasons for this, right? And I say this all the time because I think it's very important to note. One reason is like actually kind of a practical thing. If you're trying to do integrated planning and policy in a way that you're trying to look at the linkages, alignments, and tensions between a whole variety of social, economic, environmental factors, it really only makes sense to reach out to people that have direct experience and knowledge of those various social, environment, and economic factors. So there is that practical element. But then there's also this principle component where people do actually have a right to have a say in how places of values and places they live in, how these places develop and shape over time. So, you know, a big part of this idea of exploring integrated planning, and often I don't necessarily even say that my research is integrated and participatory planning, because they are part and parcel, but a big part of it is this idea of how do we engage people in the complexity of sustainable development and these challenges. How do we find ways of taking these complex systems, maps, and models and coming up with tools in order for them to be able to kind of wrap their heads around it, in order for us to be able to wrap our heads around it. You know, I mean, some of the integrated models I've worked with spit out like 350 lines of data. That's great, but I mean, who's going to be able to absorb that? Then the final point I want to leave on, and this is for all the researchers in the audience too. I'm a researcher in integrated planning. I believe in participatory process and engagement. So I also firmly believe that I should practice what I preach. And I am very committed to community-based research, because I think that any sort of process, if we're developing tools and approaches to support integrated planning, which needs to be participatory, the research should be equally participatory. The communities should be able to provide those dots. You can help them connect them, but really it's a matter of making the research as participatory as you believe the planning process should be. So with that, I mean, those are kind of the points that I always want to stress to people, because I do think it's important in terms of this research realm. And with that, I'm happy to close off my points.
Thanks very much, Dr. Newell. It's been a slice of life as always. I think Christy will kill us if we don't give her some space.
No, not at all. I actually wish this conversation didn't have to end. I feel like there's still so much more that could be delved into, but thank you both so much for sharing all of your expertise over the past hour, a little less than an hour. And with that, we just have a few final resources and notes to share with you all for those who are still sticking around. So this, like we said at the start, this is a series that has been brought to us by the School of Environment and Sustainability at Royal Roads University. Our next session is going to be in September 2021. So if you do want to check it out, we're taking a bit of a break over the summer, but then we'll be back with more of these conversations about building back better and everything that we should be considering now and really ramping up as we come back out of this COVID world that we have been living in for the past year. And as well, if you do want to check out the School of Environment and Sustainability's blog, you can see the link right there. There's lots of great resources there from our faculty members that I think a lot of you would find interesting as well. Just a little bit about our programs at a glance. So Anne, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one a little bit as well about just the different programs that we offer. And again, the conversations that we're having today is the types of conversations that we do have in a lot of our programs, which you can kind of just scroll through and see here.
Yeah, I can see the diversity. We're the biggest school in the university, and that we have undergraduate science programs face-to-face, as well as several graduate programs. And I just want to introduce we have beautiful labs here in the campus, in the new building, Sherman Gen building. You must come and visit. But one of my faculty members, Mickey Noble, is Dr. Blasto. And she brings in kindergarten to grade 8 students and has this colored lab coat on and introduces them to science and shows firsthand that, you know, instead of being whatever, the importance of science, and that even girls can be scientists. So fabulous, fabulous. She does it in her volunteer time. Then I'm delighted to tell you that we will be reinstating a graduate certificate, and we have a new graduate program, Certificate in Science and Policy of Climate Change, that has the most leading edge research based on a lot of our faculty. And I'm delighted that Dr. Newell will be joining us in 2022. I'm not supposed to announce that, but I can't help myself. And also we'll be reinstating the graduate certificate in, it's not up here, in sustainable community development. And that will have a heavy focus on integrated planning and may be of interest to planners. And then we have our 4 graduate degrees that are listed there. So and you can ladder between one program and another. Like if you want to take a course in the certificate program, that can then be applied towards a master's degree if you decide to then come in and do that. And we have a very, very diverse faculty that is sort of like, with all due respect, herding a bunch of cats, but they're wonderful.
Thank you so much, Anne. That is such a great overview of the programs. And I actually took the graduate certificate in sustainable community development. So I'm so excited that that will be coming back, and we'll have to add it back onto the slides for the next one. But really thrilled about that. Could not recommend it more. And if you are curious about our programs, you're welcome to reach out to us as well. And we do recognize we answered a lot of the questions, I think, throughout the conversation, or rather, Anne and Rob, you answered. But if we didn't get to your questions, you're welcome to reach out anytime as well. And with that, Anne and Rob, is there any final comments or thoughts before we close out the session for today that you'd like to share?
Just a quick one, because just following up on your. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Anne. I just really briefly, Christy, following up your last point. I'm happy to have people reach out to me afterwards too, directly via email. I'm assuming my contacts are listed in various places. People seem to be able to find me. So definitely, if there's any of these topics that you're interested in, reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat. It's one of the most enjoyable parts of the job, is to be able to chat about these ideas and the research. And then, sorry, go ahead, over to you.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the conversation and taking the time to listen to us talk. Be well and be safe.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. And thank you everybody again for joining us today and for listening in. So have a wonderful rest of your day.